My name is Michelle Foster and I'm the Director of the Peter McMullin Centre on Statelessness at Melbourne Law School. And I'm really pleased to be moderating this event with such an esteemed panel. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we meet today on the lands of the traditional custodians, which in my case is the lands of the Wurundjeri people. And we acknowledge and pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. Well, today we're joined by three excellent panellists to explore the important and urgent topic of the plight of refugees and asylum seekers during the pandemic. Our panellists hardly need an introduction, as they're undoubtedly known to most of you due to their high quality contributions to public discourse over many years. Gillian Triggs is currently the Assistant Secretary General and Assistant High Commissioner for Protection at the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. Prior to taking on this role, she held many important and prominent positions in Australia as an academic, practicing lawyer, advocate and public policy expert. Most recently, of course, she served as President of the Australian Human Rights Commission. Nyadol Nyuon is a commercial litigator with Arnold Bloch Leibler and vocal advocate for human rights, multiculturalism, anti-racism and refugees and asylum seekers. She has worked and volunteered extensively in these areas with a range of organisations. Among many other achievements, the Australian Human Rights Commission recognised her advocacy by awarding her the prestigious Racism It Stops With Me award in 2018. And finally, David Manne is the Executive Director and Principal Solicitor at Refugee Legal. David has been the recipient of several prestigious awards. In addition to his groundbreaking legal work in Australia, he's been appointed to the UN High Commissioner for Refugees Advisory Board of Eminent Persons and invited to attend and present at the UN High Commissioner's Dialogue on Protection Challenges on numerous occasions. So clearly we have a very well qualified panel to enable us to discuss these important issues today. So the format for today's panel is effectively a discussion amongst our panellists guided by some questions from me, which will seek to draw out a range of perspectives on the challenges both globally and domestically. We certainly welcome questions from the audience and we encourage you to use the Q&A function, which you will see on the bottom of your screen, to send through your questions. Now we had over 200 registrations for today's event, which is wonderful, but unfortunately it means we won't be able to answer every question. However, we'll have about 15 to 20 minutes at the end of the webinar and I'll have an opportunity then to sort of curate and put those questions to the panel. So to get us started, I think it's important to reflect on recent events. In a virtual briefing to the Security Council just last week, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi, observed that the COVID-19 pandemic had further exposed refugees' vulnerability, stripping away their hope for a better future. Of course, the reasons people flee, including war and persecution, have not paused during the pandemic. Hence, protection needs have not gone away. Yet by June 2020, it's estimated that 219 states and territories had implemented over 64,000 restrictive measures, predominantly concerning border closures and entry restrictions. And at least 99 states made no exception for people seeking asylum. In addition, the pause in resettlement travel since March has delayed the departures of some 10,000 refugees for resettlement countries. Hence, this impact on mobility has been profound. In addition, of course, serious concerns have been voiced about the treatment of asylum seekers and refugees in a range of contexts. So let's begin by hearing from the panel and sort of delving into these issues in more depth, and in particular concerning what human rights issues for refugees and asylum seekers have been raised by the pandemic. And I thought, Gillian, it would be wonderful to start with you, given your regional and international perspective on these issues.
Well, thank you very much, Michelle, and that's a very accurate introduction, because of course the COVID-19 is a global health pandemic. It's affecting everybody, but it's particularly shone a light on the most vulnerable people, and refugees, internally displaced people, stateless people are especially vulnerable. And this year, in fact, just in the last few days, we've announced numbers, statistics from last year, and we're now nearly 80 million people who have fled their homes, either across borders or in their own countries, for reasons of conflict, predominant and discrimination and persecution. So we've got that vulnerability. I think that's the first point, which of course has an impact in health. Mercifully, and this needs to be recognised, the numbers of refugees affected by COVID have in fact been quite low. And one of the things we'll be doing is looking at why that's happened. But in terms of the effect, it's much greater than health. And that is, as you correctly pointed out, 164 countries have completely or partially closed their borders and closed down their asylum processes. And we, I think for the first time in the history of the UN High Commission for Refugees, has actually suspended a resettlement. So 10,000 have not been able to be resettled. The good news is that we are just starting that resettlement program in the last few days as some flights become available. Now, the point that I'm making here is that the legal impact on the right to claim asylum has been profound. In addition to that, there are some countries that have not only refused to allow an asylum claim contrary to the most fundamental principles, but have actually returned refugees to the place of persecution. So that's the first answer, these changes in laws. But the second, and the one that's proving to be in some ways even more powerful and more destructive of lives, are the social and economic impacts on refugees. They are at the bottom of the pyramid, if you like. They're the most vulnerable in informal economies, and they're the first to lose their jobs. So that once you have a loss of livelihood, even in that informal economy, then you have all the other problems that go with it, the social economic in particular. And perhaps even surprisingly immediate has been a huge spike in gender-based violence. And of course, the impact on children who've not been able to go to school, who become more vulnerable, and of course, traumatized by many family circumstances. So many basic human rights are being affected. Arbitrary detention in the guise of COVID-19, loss of income, loss of work, people being evicted from their houses, lack of access to social and welfare services, and lack of access to livelihood. So it's a series of emergencies and crises built on underlying problems for these vulnerable people in the community.
Yeah, thank you so much. You've certainly covered a range of issues there. And as you say, we see these practices, unfortunately, across the globe. But maybe bringing it just a bit closer to home, David, would you like to share some of your thoughts about the impact and the human rights impact on refugees and asylum seekers, particularly in Australia?
Yes, sure. And look, of course, as Gillian has highlighted very comprehensively, the pandemic is, of course, a global phenomenon. It's a global public health emergency. And certain vulnerable groups globally are particularly at risk, and that and in particular that includes asylum seekers and refugees, and also many migrants. And I guess what's really one of the underpinning themes of all of this, a common theme that underpins the predicament of people, is the exacerbation of vulnerabilities of those that are already the most vulnerable. And already with the least protection. And I guess on the domestic front, on the Australian front, the Australian phenomena may not be as stark as the examples that Gillian has provided, but the challenges and the risks are there, and they're serious. And it's really clear in Australia that we're not, in fact, all in this together. That when it comes to asylum seekers and refugees, and indeed many migrants, the truth is that many vulnerable people in our community have been deliberately excluded. They've been subject to deliberate, systematic exclusion, and they've been left behind. And I mean, some of these people are trapped in immigration detention across the country, including even in hotels, in cramped and overcrowded conditions. With standards of social distancing and self-isolation that are required in general by the community. For people in detention, an impossibility. Many others are in the community across Australia suffering on temporary visas, on bridging visas, or with no visas at all. And again, are deliberately excluded from access to means of basic survival. So they're struggling to survive. And the shape that this is taking is it's taking a number of shapes or aspects. But what we know is that when we leave some out, inevitably we endanger the health of all of us. And this is in fact the case in Australia because, what we have here is, for example, with healthcare, no universal access to Medicare or to medical treatment for many people in the community seeking asylum. There are significant barriers to people getting tested, to getting treated. Many people can't afford the healthcare that they need, and some fear accessing it, given other exclusionary policies and punitive policies. Income support is another example of this, where for many women, men and children, many of whom, and this includes many men and women who have lost their jobs, which was their only form of income, there is literally no access to economic stimulus package measures such as JobKeeper or JobSeeker entitlement. So many of these people are the first to have fallen through the cracks of the safety net that discriminates on the basis literally of visa status. So I would summarise this in general as in this way, that there has been a paradigm shift in the way that we live and work globally. And in many respects, governments across the globe have responded accordingly, and we've seen many measures, including stimulus packages, etc., to respond to this. There have been some, varying degrees with different practices, but I think what we've seen here is also that there have been stark exceptions to that. And when it comes to asylum seekers and refugees, certainly in Australia, and I would say globally to a large extent, but certainly in Australia, it is one of the stark exceptions where there has not been, where there has been effectively deliberate exclusion of people in areas that matter most and are impacting on the most: health, income support, etc. I might just finish by also saying that on this point, that there is profound visa insecurity as well, that many people are living with profound visa insecurity. They're going through the process at the moment seeking asylum, have been left in limbo for many years in many cases, and this visa insecurity has compounded the sense of insecurity and uncertainty, and indeed the risks to health. And the risk to health, of course, in this context, given the shared responsibility, endangers not only these people but all of us. And so, on that point, I guess what we're looking at is not only the profound effects of exclusion and the policy, the profound concerns about policy excluding people on a moral and legal basis, the profound concerns on a moral and legal basis, but also I would say the short-sightedness of such practices, which, as I say, given the shared responsibility that is central to the response to the pandemic, affects all of us.
Great. So, I think what we're really seeing here then is, as you both articulated so well, is really this contradiction. So on one hand, as you said, Gillian, we see quite blatant violations of human rights and refugee obligations, particularly non-reforma, the sort of boat pushbacks, sending people away without screening, sending people away who are known to be potentially qualifying for asylum, family separation, detention, compromised access to health and socioeconomic conditions or benefits. And then at the same time, David, as you say, there's this sort of greater sense of community. In this sense, the governments are actually doing more than they normally would to support the community. So what is going on here? And I suppose, Nyadol, that's where I'd love to bring you in, and in particular your thoughts on what the impact has been in terms of the increase in xenophobia, hate speech and racism. And is that somehow the clue to this contradiction here, why governments are able to get away with treating this particular group in the way they are?
Look, I don't really know if I can drill it down to that, but I think what even happened at the initial stages when the issue of coronavirus was becoming clear that it would be a public health issue, we did see attacks on Asian Australians, particularly in supermarkets and their places of work. And I think because there's this resentment apparently that somehow the disease originated in China and somehow Asians Australians were responsible to that. There was also some concern initially about the government response when taking Australians of Asian descent, and I think putting them outside of the country initially in terms of their response. Well, when it became obvious that there was a larger group of people, bringing them in, and some people I think saw some race disparity in the initial response. But even the government economic stimuli packages also have sort of impacted groups like international students more, who predominantly tend to be from Asian countries, impacted them more because it hasn't been extended to them. There've been huge lines of people looking just for basic needs, and sometimes what has happened is that local councils have had to step in to just provide these students with food and just the very, very basic things to survive, because they've completely been neglected in the government response. So even if the intention of some of these policies had never been, had not been racist, I don't think, or had a racial element to it, the impacts of it tend to affect those people who are most vulnerable and who are in minority groups. And you've seen that play out even in places like the United States, where the health impact of coronavirus has impacted Black people more than any other groups of immigrants. And I think that's, they're not immigrants, but more than other groups of people. And I think that just really reflects what COVID-19 has done. It's just shown a light on some of the existing gaps in our society, so the most vulnerable have ended up being impacted more. Migrants have ended up being impacted more, simply because as they come here, they tend to occupy those jobs that are the first to go, and unlikely to be the people that end up coming back if the economy bounces back again. And another angle where I've seen race and xenophobia become an issue is the concern about the high rates of unemployment now, and the question of relating that to the issue of immigration. And I think the conversation has been around the fact that since so many Australians are out of jobs, that we shouldn't be bringing in any other people to be taking our jobs when the economy would be struggling to recover. And so I think that's going to be a live issue going forward, because one of the obvious issues about COVID-19 is that the impacts of it are going to be long-term. And I think that eventually they're going to very much play into our politics. And immigration has always been a sensitive topic of discussion in Australia. And it would be interesting to see how that intersect with the politics as we discuss way forward in terms of economic recovery, and whether there'll be, again, reliance on race and concept of race and dog whistling, even in the upcoming election.
Indeed. So we've begun with, I suppose, from a rather negative perspective, identifying all of the troublesome practices, both globally and locally. Maybe we'll turn our attention, and particularly starting with you, Gillian. I mean, do we see examples of best practice across the globe, both in terms of, we talked about the problems with basic access to protection in terms of many countries violating non-reform law, but do we see the opposite? Have we seen some countries that have in fact been able to make exceptions and also, being more inclusive in terms of the socioeconomic, the right to work, the right to healthcare that we've just been talking about? Are there any glimmers of hope out there, Gillian?
Well, there definitely are, and I think that's a point that does need to be made. It's a very mixed environment globally. We have some of the worst practices, the externalization of asylum seeker processes, the pushing back to poorer countries, the pushback of boats, all of the things that we've mentioned. But we've also seen some of the most enlightened and exciting practices. And I think perhaps we could say some countries, and this has been a very interesting development over the last few months, have really used technology. And they've said, well, we can both protect our borders and protect public health, and we can ensure that we allow asylum claims to be made. And we're going to do it with new and innovative ways. We're going to have remote interviews. We're going to establish quarantine processes which allow these applications to be made. We're going to allow dossier applications, in other words, purely on the paperwork initially. So there are many countries that have acted in a generous way. Portugal, for example, has suspended the need for a visa. If you came with any kind of visa or on the basis of an application for asylum, that remains for the period of the pandemic crisis. Countries such as Colombia have hosting 1.5 million refugees or asylum seekers from the region, but largely Venezuela, has been meticulous in including these vulnerable people in education systems, in access to health. Partly, of course, for a very practical reason that you must include in health treatment. If you exclude certain groups on the grounds of their legal status, then you risk the public health of the community generally. But that's a more self-serving objective, but much more widely, many countries are taking a very inclusive approach. And just to pick up on David's point, inclusion really has become my favorite word. I think should be the Oxford Dictionary's word of the year, because that really is the only viable solution. As I say, we've had to suspend our own resettlement program. Many of the situations of refugees and asylum seekers are prolonged. It's the 70th anniversary of the Refugee Convention coming up very shortly. And it's been rather interesting to remember that at the time of or just after the Second World War, as the Refugee Convention was negotiated, they were only dealing with about 2.5 million people. Now we're dealing with 80 million. The problem is compounding every year. This year, it's about 9 million more than it was the year before, for various reasons, largely conflict. But the point I'm making is that the pandemic has really exposed the desperate need for inclusive practices. And we do find them across many parts of the world. So I think we should build on those inclusive practices to the ability to continue with asylum claims regardless of the pandemic, but to ensure that everyone has access to the kind of health service David's been talking about, and that we ensure that the children are in school. I'd say most countries do ensure that children have access to education. Not all, but almost all have embraced the children and brought them into school systems. Now, because asylum families are much more vulnerable, they often live in the outskirts of areas or in areas that are very hard to contact. They are going to be they're going to be affected much more than others, but nonetheless, there are the green shoots of optimism. And one that I might mention, because I'm not being a particularly technological person myself, I'm absolutely encouraged by, in Mali, for example, they are now buying radios, just good old fashioned radios, in order to achieve remote education for children in one of the most impoverished and conflict-ridden zones of the world in the Sahel. And I think stories like that show us human resilience, but also that we can use all forms of technology, sophisticated or simple, to help people in these situations.
So, I mean, just to follow up, I mean, you're describing good practice across a range of countries, not just the global north, not just rich countries that have the resources. And I think that's really significant. You say that, you know, in part it may be self-serving because inclusiveness is good for everyone. But how can we convince the many states that in fact are not adopting that at the moment to you know, comply with these policies or to introduce better policies?
Well, that's really the challenge. And in fact, it is curious that some of the poorest and most vulnerable countries in the world have been the most generous and open in their policies. And perhaps to make that point even more strongly, 85% of refugees and displaced people are being hosted by the world's poorest or middle income countries. So Turkey, for example, has hosted nearly 4 million Syrians for 9 years, for protracted periods of time. These are not just short conflicts and then you can return home. Children are growing up in refugee camps and have been for many years. So that's the depth of the problem. But to answer your question, what do we do to convince those countries that, or other countries that they need to adopt more inclusive policies? It really isn't easy. If I had a simple answer, I'm sure you I'd be up there. Advocacy is important. I think leadership is important. I in my former job and in this one, I can see more powerfully than ever before how important it is for one's political leaders to say, we will stand by fundamental rights. as we try to deal with this with this pandemic crisis. So if you haven't got political leadership, and notoriously, you know, in some countries we don't, then you see spikes in COVID, you see fundamental breaches of human rights, and you see catastrophic situations for vulnerable communities, including refugees and asylum seekers. So one, the political level, but the other, I think advocacy is important. I know from my former job and now in this one that advocacy is hard because to a degree you often speak to people who agree with you. It's very hard to get to the audiences you really want to persuade and to convince. So but there's a lot of behind the scenes negotiations and discussions going on, but in an extremely worrying situation, Michelle, and I'm sure you're aware of this, where European countries are now looking at very restrictive practices, externalization of asylum processes, and a fear, and as Nyadol has pointed out, the fear of immigration, the fear of people, the other, coming from other cultures and races. That's being increased. But I mention Europe because those are the very countries we would hope to see leadership on these questions. And that's not a consistent pattern, but there are very worrying trends, and that's hard to deal with. So how can I answer your question? I think we have to continue advocacy. We have to keep telling the stories. I think Nyadol, David, Michelle, you know this very well, that when I say 80 million people, it's a statistic that the brain cannot manage to understand. You have to tell the stories. Whether it's growing up in a Kakuma refugee camp, whether it's a child at Christmas Island, whether it's people for years on Manus and Nauru, only those stories will soften the approach. But for many of our politicians, that doesn't work. So I don't have a solution. I think we just have to keep talking about the humanity and about what we can do, and look at some of those best practices.
Well, let's think about what we can do more locally as well. So as you say, picking up that idea of advocacy, which of course can be manifested in legal advocacy. So David, I might ask you just to comment on what we can do here, both in terms of more particularly legal assistance and advocacy to try to implement or affect the human rights of asylum seekers and refugees here in Australia.
Yeah, sure. I might just, by the way, just pick up on something that Gillian said first, which I couldn't agree more with, and that is really that there has never been a greater importance on governments, showing responsibility for economic and social rights protection. It is so fundamental, and it must be inclusive and equitable. And the question about how we achieve that, I couldn't agree also more with Gillian's point about political leadership. It may well be that the political leadership needs to draw more on, enlightened self-interest. If that's part of the response, and perhaps Portugal is a good example on that front, has been referred to in granting asylum seekers residence. But really, I think that one of the angles on this must be that discriminatory practices endanger us all, and that, as we know, the virus doesn't discriminate, and we cannot afford to do so ourselves. And so really, I think a lot of the approach from a political leadership point of view must be dictated by the health imperative. On the legal front, I think one of the critical aspects of this is that, and Gillian has pointed to this too, is the fundamental importance of upholding human rights standards and law. There is a real risk in crises that it will go the other way, that in fact that human rights will be neglected or suspended on the basis, various bases, including justifications of public health emergency or the like. Never has, I think, there been a greater need to in fact draw upon human rights standards, including legal standards, to shape our response. I wanted to go to the issue in particular of legal responses for refugees locally for a moment. And I think that one of the critical issues, one of the critical risks here is that because of the exclusion that I mentioned in relation to access to health and to the basic income support or safety net, there is a very real risk of people becoming destitute. Destitution can compound vulnerability, and it can also, as part of that, compound or impede the ability of people to be able to engage with the legal system to present their case for asylum. So that's become one of our very real concerns at the moment, is that that it's not just one form of exclusion which impacts, but it actually is the overall predicament of someone who is seeking asylum and seeking to present their case and to have it fairly heard. I do think on this score that one thing that's very important, though, and this has been a very important development more recently, has been legal services. So ours, Refugee Legal, and other legal services nationally and internationally, looking at different ways to provide assistance. And one of the very important developments here has been to look at ways of continuing to provide vital legal assistance to people remotely. Most of the assistance that we provide and that other lawyers provide here and globally usually is in person, and ideally it would be. Because of the isolation measures, lockdowns, etc., we have shifted, as of others, very quickly to do things differently, but basically with the fundamental aim of ensuring that people can still get legal help and still get access to justice. So we've been doing a lot of our work remotely, and both in Australia and internationally, and I'm pleased to say that it probably has what has developed here have been new ways of doing things which could well actually open up access in the future in ways that we haven't seen before. So that, for example, asylum seekers who are in remote locations, or because of other factors, either obstacles, are unable to access legal help and to assert their rights, or to even be advised of their rights, let alone to be able to assert them, may well, given technology, and this we come back to the point of technology that Gillian raised, because of technology, the use of the smart and effective use of technology, it may well improve access to justice. We've certainly seen it being very effectively used in our agency with our amazing staff and volunteers, and we've really seen a boost in volunteer numbers working with us remotely to assist so many people. I just wanted to make one other point too, and it's a very important one, I think, about the Global Refugee Forum, the UNHCR's Global Refugee Forum, and there was a pledge late last year which is being developed, and it was a pledge whereby 125,000 hours of pro bono assistance was pledged by top-tier law firms around the globe to work effectively, and it was developed. The pledge was developed by a small amount of legal NGOs, including us and other partners globally, with pro bono agencies. And I think that the point of it is that we're developing this at the moment and amidst the pandemic, and it has the very real potential here again to harness an extraordinary goodwill. There really is a vast and, I think, untapped reservoir of goodwill globally to provide assistance to refugees. And this is one of the endeavours at the moment, is to effectively harness the pro bono resources of law firms globally to work with expert legal NGOs to provide something that is of such fundamental importance to the plight of people seeking asylum, and that is legal help to put their case.
Great. So it's wonderful to hear such optimistic thoughts. Nyadol, just turning to you, I suppose just continuing that theme of advocacy and what can be done to change attitude, because we know there's such a link between attitudes and the public attitudes and government policy. You're very experienced in community advocacy. What thoughts do you have about the way forward? I mean, you already mentioned earlier that this is an ongoing issue, as unemployment sort of remains at a very high level. These issues around racism and xenophobia, exclusion are going to continue. So what are your thoughts on what we can do, particularly in Australia?
I think I definitely agree. I think, the need for leadership is really important, and the need for advocacy, it's very important. And the third thing would be thinking creatively about solutions outside of what we're currently doing. But in terms of the first two, which is leadership and advocacy, I think it is worthy to acknowledge that we're kind of operating in what seems to be a very hostile environment sometimes. If you look at the current leadership, particularly the countries that have historically been seen as responsible or available to resettle the large numbers of refugees, whether it's in the European countries or the United States, the kind of leadership in that space over the last few years, at least in my view, seem to be shifting quite far off to the right. I mean, and I think big political shifts like Brexit were really underpinned by these issues of immigration. And that directly links towards refugee. I think one of the biggest posters that one of the campaigners for Brexit did was this big picture of refugees flowing essentially into the country, and there've been deep criticism of the I think it's Angela Merkel, might be getting her name wrong, the German chancellor, for letting in refugees, large numbers of refugees to resettle in the country. And then when we look to the United States, we've seen almost an absence of leadership at all. In fact, probably creating a very negative environment. I mean, Donald Trump came down the aisle with accusing Mexicans of being rapists. And so I think that is the kind of the environment of leadership we're now sort of operating in. And it can be very, very limiting. And in Australia, we haven't necessarily have the best of approach in that space. We've got mandatory detention and offshore processing, some of these very things that other countries are now trying to emulate and bring in as their way of managing, the refugee crisis. In terms of advocacy, I think you see similar issues, a constant attack on advocates, the constant bullying online and spaces online. So I think that if it starts a space that organizations want to utilize, it's going to be an area that we need to work on how to protect particularly younger advocates that want to come in and speak in that space and how they should be mentored. Because I think it can also be, if you don't have the right support, it can be really, really lonely space to occupy, especially when you feel as if you're getting attacked from some of the mainstream or established institutions, say, the likes of Arnold Bloch. Not to name names, but so it's a really scary space, I suppose, even for advocates to step in. But I think that it doesn't stop us from thinking, from continue to campaign. These spaces have never been easy to campaign in. It has never been easy to advocate for the rights of minorities and vulnerable people, because they are obviously not the people with the power to shift politics or to influence politics. You're always working from the bottom up, and I think that's always going to be the case. One of the, in terms of thinking creatively about solutions, one of the recent programs I've heard of, and it's being pursued, is the community sponsorship initiative, where it's essentially a program trying to establish the equivalent of what is happening in Canada, happening in Canada, and I think in the UK as well. And there is a group here that wants to do the same thing and campaign for that and try to get bipartisan support on it. And I think it might be possible to do so because, again, I think it kind of falls into that kind of enlightened self-interest, because people who do come through the community sponsorship programs tend to be much well supported, are likely to get job and employment, and less likely to depend on welfare. And also there is the broader benefits of the community development program, sponsorship program of refugee, because it also changed attitudes within communities that then sponsors refugee and people that have been displaced. And so, I think in terms of thinking creatively about solutions, that's one of the areas where we can continue to think creatively.
Great. All of your observations are so pertinent and excellent. One thing that I think, though, sometimes is missing from the debate is the role of refugee voice. And I think your point about creating essentially a safe space for advocacy really raises this question about what is the role of refugee voice. It's something I'm grappling with, and many of us in academia are grappling with. Sort of refrain of nothing about us without us, I think has resonated in recent years. Gillian, you would be aware there's quite a few international sort of advocacy groups now that are refugee-led, and then in fact have a role in advocacy at the UN level. We will turn to questions from the audience very soon, but perhaps you could just reflect on that before we do.
Well, yes, we're making a really big effort in UNHCR, the refugee agency, to ensure that the first person to speak is a refugee. Now, it's not always easy because you don't know which refugees are a fair representative of a point of view, but nonetheless, we are trying very hard. The other thing that I think is starting to emerge more in the discussion is the need for more localization. Of course, here I am in Geneva. It's the headquarters of the UN human rights bodies, and in particular, of course, the Refugee Agency. But what we're trying to do is increasingly get staff out to the field and to get that refugee voice as a loud voice. Can I say one other thing just before we hand over, because I know you're going to be dealing with questions, but one thing I do find rather marvelous to talk about, and doesn't always go terribly well it's internationally, but of course, here we are in Australia, or you're in Australia. Australia is really very good at using technology to get remote education and remote health services. We've done this for a long time, 100 years, and we've been very successful. And one of the things we're trying to do, David mentioned briefly the forum, the refugee forum that we held here last year. We had 1,400 pledges, including the legal service commitments. But one of the things we're trying to do is to find ways of getting community responses from the private sector, refugee groups and others to give effect to these more innovative policies. And I think we can do it. We've just got to emphasize solidarity, as of course the Secretary General is doing. So thank you very much.
Can I just make one quick point, Michelle, before questions too, that I think a lot of this points to in terms of advocacy, a multidimensional approach. It must be one. I mean, I can certainly say in terms of legal advocacy that we can continue to look at ways of where there are profound deprivations of rights and really serious endangerment of life in terms of the approach to people seeking asylum, both here and globally. And we can provide legal assistance. We can seek to challenge injustice, both of people detained and in the community, and we'll continue to do so. But it all and that can be very potent, but it of course has its limits too. But I think that a multi-dimensional approach is critical, and that includes, as lawyers, ensuring that what we do works with other approaches and is inclusive, and indeed, on that front, works very closely with refugee communities as well.
Nyadol, do you have any last comments before I hand over to our audience?
No, I'm okay. Let's get
Great. Well, we do have quite a few questions, which is wonderful. So perhaps I'll present the first here from Emma Nyuon. Welcome, Emma. I can't see you, but great to have you here. So Emma asks, has the Black Lives Matter movement had an impact, positive or negative, on the challenges facing refugees and asylum seekers in times of COVID-19? I'm not sure who wants to answer that first. I'll have a go.
Yeah, I don't know, but I do think that some of the resistance towards settling refugees now is because that a lot of these refugees do come from backgrounds and races that don't look like what we think Australians look like. So I think there is a racism aspect of the resistance towards refugees. And if you look at some of the media coverage, the articles like foreign invasion, that language is very clear, that these are other people with other culture and other races, and they're going to come and dilute this country and the way we want to see ourselves. So I think in that time, because the Black Lives Matter movement is about challenging both systemic racism and overt racism, I do think that if these are conversations that are pursued and policies are changed, that yes, it can have effect on the rights and the privileges that asylum seekers and refugees can enjoy, particularly when those people come from the kind of group or look like the kind of people whose life don't matter. So I do think that's the case, but I think that it's being politicized instead of it being seen as something that is campaigning for historical rights for African Americans in the United States, or Indigenous people in custody here and the death in custody. I think what worries is that if it becomes really politicized and become a very partisan issue, then I'm not really sure whether it advances this conversation at all, and in fact just create a much more toxic environment.
Great, thanks. So I have a question here that's probably more for you, Gillian, about leadership from Maria O'Sullivan. And she asks, on the issue of leadership, how problematic is it that Australia and the US did not sign the Global Compact on Migration?
Well, I think generally, as I've said, leadership is hugely important. And of course, the more important the country or the more influential the country, the more significant that leadership becomes. Certainly, some states chose not to sign the Compact on Migration, but overwhelmingly states did. And on the Compact that, of course, is the greatest concern to us, or relevant to our work at UNHCR, is, of course, the Compact on Refugees. And that was overwhelmingly supported, including by Australia. And then, of course, supported by the General Assembly, which affirmed those principles. And if I could just mention them very, very briefly, because I think perhaps not everybody knows what these compacts say, but the Compact on Refugees picks up two key ideas. One, global solidarity. We work together. In other words, we cannot continue with unilateral policies that don't take into account the region and the global obligations. We must work together, and COVID-19 has demonstrated the importance of that principle like nothing else could have done. But the second key point that emerged from the Compact is that globally we share equitably the burdens and responsibilities for refugees and asylum seekers. So I mentioned Turkey. Turkey is an extraordinary example, but entering its 10th year, a host to 4 million Syrian refugees, countries in Latin America hosting millions emerging from Venezuela, and of course countries in Africa as well. So I think the principles of the global compacts, whether on refugees or migration, but refugees in particular, are now more relevant than they've ever been. And that is why we want to move back to the language of responsibility sharing. We cannot act unilaterally. We cannot close our borders down and expect this problem to go away. It won't. And we can only deal with something as virulent as a global health crisis of this kind if we do it together.
Indeed. So I have a lot of questions asking things like, what can we do? And what more can an individual do? But I guess a more specific question comes from Avita, which was, what more can be done for those asylum seekers who've been brought back to Australia from offshore, essentially under the Medevac legislation prior to its repeal? This is probably more a question for you, David. You know, obviously in detention, especially in these now civic hotspots in Darebin, I think it would be. And obviously many have not received treatment. So what thoughts do you have on that issue?
Yes, well, look, if I can sort of, again, put it in context, I mean, many people have been uprooted and you know, fled in fear from their homes globally, and some have made it to states like Australia that have signed up to the Refugees Convention and have every potential they can and should protect people. And instead what we see here is, you know, many people who sought asylum in Australia, were forced to offshore detention and left in limbo for years, became critically unwell, and then were medevaced to Australia. We and others were very involved in assisting people who were critically unwell and couldn't get the treatment they needed offshore in Nauru or PNG to be brought to Australia for that treatment. Those people, most of those people, have then, having been brought to Australia, have then been consigned to indefinite detention, either in, you know, sort of detention centres or indeed even in hotels, incarcerated in hotels in the suburbs of Brisbane or Melbourne. And the question continues well, there are a number of questions. I mean, the first one is that astonishingly recently, the proposition put by the government was that that the Medevac laws were responsible for the detention. Well, those laws were never responsible for the detention and have since been repealed in any event. But I think that what that proposition raises is the real issue, and that is that there are powers at the disposal of the government here, the federal government, to release people from detention into the community. And there are at least two good reasons at the moment for doing so. One is just a very immediate, it's not even, this one doesn't even go to an objection about mandatory indefinite detention and the deprivation of rights, the violation of rights, and the harm that is, the profound harm that is caused by that practice. prolonged detention, but also, but it doesn't even go to that issue. It just goes to the public health issue that I mentioned before, and that is that there is a very real risk of putting people in these overcrowded and cramped conditions, that they are at heightened risk of contracting coronavirus, and have they're trapped, and health experts have continued to say this is a major risk and a profound concern, and so that's one of the concerns, and the other one is, of course, that is the objection to the mandatory indefinite detention of people in this context, or at all, indeed. What can be done about it? Well, one issue is the question of whether there can be legal challenges. They have been pursued and are continuing to be investigated. They're very difficult in this context, I have to say. There is no ready solution to that through, test case challenges. They will continue to be pursued and investigated by us and others. What is also critical here, I think, is to highlight the predicament of the people detained, and to, in civil society, to continue to urge government to use the powers of discretion under Australian law that are available to release people who remain at severe risk, not only because of the coronavirus, but more generally. It's very difficult. The legal avenues at the moment are very difficult, but we continue to pursue them. But I think this is a very good example of there being not one angle on this, but a multi-dimensional approach is critical, and that includes, ensuring that the stories are told, and that civil society is involved in urging change on this. Because what really should happen, and has happened in other countries, some other countries, is the release of people during the pandemic into the community, particularly people at heightened risk on a health basis. And that just hasn't happened in Australia.
Thank you. Another question for you, Gillian, from Jane McAdam. Welcome, Jane. So Jane observed that, as you said, Gillian, at the outset, there's good news in that refugees don't appear to have contracted COVID-19, and Jane sort of wants to explore, why this is. Do you know how much this is a factor of effective measures being put in place in camps and settlements, etc., or is it actually a data gap? So how is UNHCR and others monitoring rates of infection amongst populations of concern?
Well, thank you, Jane, and thank you for joining us. Yes, this is going to be, when this COVID-19 subsides, we will have some extraordinary things to look at and try to understand. We at UNHCR are monitoring daily. We have 426 field offices throughout the world, and as accurate a level of data is coming through as we can possibly manage, but there will always be a data gap and there will always be inaccuracies, and I think that's a phenomenon throughout the world. But it is curious, and we've asked ourselves the question: is it because refugees are in camps and that they are separated and isolated from other people? Well, that's not really a very satisfactory answer, because most refugees these days are not in camps, and there are some camps, of course, that continue to exist, but for the most part, we're trying to get people out of camps. Most are in urban areas and suburban areas, so that's not quite a good explanation. Another explanation is that many refugees are young. 50% of refugees and asylum seekers are children. And they seem to be less vulnerable. Another is that in Africa, and this is again one of those weird paradoxes, but in Africa, they've been through the Ebola crisis and other pandemics, and in fact, there's been a very disciplined response by African nations. They're very quick to say, we actually don't want Europeans coming. It's been an issue for humanitarian workers, actually. So I think we don't know the full answers to Jane's question, but I think it's going to be absolutely intriguing to find out what the differences are. But at the moment, it is a very noticeable fact that very few deaths have arisen in Africa. The numbers are still very small, but sadly, they are rising, particularly in West Central Africa, the Sahel area. The numbers, of course, are skyrocketing in Venezuela or North Central America. So that's really the new center of the pandemic. So it's very mixed. We are putting everything we can into preventive measures for Africa. And a very simple example is that we do, of course, and historically have always done emergency work as well as the more, perhaps abstract work on the legal principles and on advocacy. But we recently delivered 1 million bars of soap to Burkina Faso and Mali. Now, so it's at that level of prevention, which is vitally important, as well as the more sophisticated levels of advocacy, government negotiation, working. If I can make one last point, one really important initiative that's been emerging and relatively new for me, I must say, is working with the big international financial institutions. The World Bank has been extraordinary. They are now giving, as part of its refugee window of its lending possibilities, they're giving grants to countries, not loans. That is a big step forward, and the big financial institutions have the money to start to build extraordinarily fragile health systems, particularly in Latin America and Africa.
Great, thank you. Look, we have 1 minute left, so I will put one last question. As I said, I have a lot of questions here which are really about what we can do, what an individual person can do. But I think Felicia puts it really well, and it's directed to you, Nyadol. She says, Nyadol, you spoke about finding ways to advocate outside what we've been doing. Could you speak to that, please? I've been a refugee advocate for 17 years and I'm out of ideas. I know we've already touched on this, but perhaps if you just have any final thoughts about what individuals and groups out there can do to assist. Nyadol, did you want to?
Oh, sorry, I was just unmuting. The program I mentioned before, the community initiative program, it's not a new program, but it will be new in Australia. And the idea is to get groups of people, whether they're churches, schools, or just a group of friends that come together. And they would then sponsor a refugee person, and they will be assisted through the process. They will be trained on how to assist that person when they arrive in this country. And then, they will support that person through their settlement process. I think that's it's worked really well in Canada. And I know it's been, they've been tried in the UK. And I think that's a creative space in terms of moving away from just relying on the humanitarian program that the government normally brings refugees through. In terms of other ways, I think I don't know, nothing comes to mind at the moment, but I think that kind of the program is the one that I'll think that has the ability of being taken up by both parties, because I think when it comes to refugee policies, it can become a really partisan issue and not get traction on both sides. But I think this kind of a program might be able to, because it takes away some of the fears that arise about refugees coming here and relying on welfare, because the program does show that most of refugees who come through the community sponsorship program do get work. And it can be really pitched directly to both parties as something that can assist. The only issue with that, the concern is whether or not if that program was to be taken up by Australian government, whether it will be in addition to the humanitarian program exist, or it would be taken out of the numbers that Australia normally provides, and that's a sensitive one, because you do not want to limit the space. The preferable thing would be for it to be in addition to Australia humanitarian program.
Great. I'm going to hand over to David for the last word.
Oh, well, thank you. Look, in terms of what we can do, I think globally, I think that, and it's the same in Australia, I think the same theme is there are three broad issues. One is to strengthen, effective responses to the public health threat. I think the second is to mitigate the broader impacts of the pandemic on people's rights and lives, and particularly the vulnerable, including refugees and asylum seekers. And that means ending the exclusion of access to healthcare and to income support, etc., and to release people from detention into safer accommodation. And also, I think thirdly, I think there's a very real risk. The pandemic didn't happen in a vacuum, but it's to ensure that that we do everything we can to avoid the exacerbation of the impact of the pandemic in a world where there are many other crises, such as the global humanitarian crisis, and to look at avoiding creating new crises out of it, or look at ways to avoid that. But look, I think at a local level, what can we do? I think there are 3 key points to finish on. And the first starts at a very, very local level, and that is neighbours and your local community, looking at ways to provide help to people, to asylum seekers and refugees, many of whom are suffering in the community at the moment, or in detention locally. And so to provide whatever support is possible, material or otherwise, or time. The second, and a sense of solidarity. The second is to volunteer. We've actually seen a boost in volunteer numbers. We have 550 volunteers, and we've seen a boost in numbers. Perhaps people have a little bit more time. It's also being able to work remotely has really increased capacity for people to help. So volunteer, I'd strongly suggest. And the third is, to look at, if you can, chipping in by donating to frontline services, legal and otherwise. I think that is also a really powerful way to contribute. But look, I just wanted to also finish by, and I'm sure, Michelle, you'll thank all the panelists yourself, but I just wanted to actually thank everyone, but also yourself particularly for moderating so excellently, and really appreciate it, and for all the work that you do at the Peter McMullin Centre for Statelessness. So thank you.
Thank you so much, David. Well, look, I think the audience will agree we could spend another hour talking about these issues, probably hours, but we do need to bring it to a close. I should have mentioned at the beginning that Gillian was extremely generous in getting up at the crack of dawn, Geneva time, and no doubt has an extremely busy day ahead, so we won't detain her any longer. But I will close by thanking our panel very much for what I think has been a really enlightening conversation. We have highlighted many of the challenges, many of the bad practices, if you like, but I think we've also left with some hope that there are glimmers of hope. There is good practice out there, and hopefully everyone feels more informed, but also inspired as well. So thank you very much to David, Nyadol and Gillian for a wonderful panel. I'm sure you would normally get a resounding applause. It's a little bit harder to hear that by Zoom, but thank you once again. Thank you to all of you out there for joining in, and thank you very much for the refugee legal team for organising all of this and facilitating it so well. So thank you and good afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.